name is Eric and I'm with Dead Reckoning Campers. Today, for beginners, I'm going to be showing you how I coat my campers, and obviously you can see it's over foam. Probably the first thing is the preparation of the foam is the key. I've already bonded two pieces together with collide silica and epoxy and filleted the inside edge. Gave it a nice curve with glass bubbles and epoxy resin. Now my preferred epoxy resin is Reka products out of Florida. Great product. The next thing, I'll stick to this. So the preparation of the surface, you want to make sure you take an orbital sander with maybe an 80 grit and remove all of the shine to the product and any lettering and things like that. Then I like to finish it by going over it with a really rough sanding block, and all you're going to do is scuff it up. You're going to see the scratch marks in it. That's great because foam is itself a closed cell product and things don't necessarily like to bond to it. So you're going to want to scratch that surface up real well. Make sure all your corners are rounded, and clean it up with a vacuum. Sometimes I'll also wipe it down with a degreaser, just something that dries fast so you can just wipe it off, make sure the substrate is clean. So with that being said, next step is how you choose your fiberglass cloths. Now this is a 6-ounce fiberglass cloth, again from Reka. It's a great product. You can kind of see the weave in it real well. This stuff wets out great. It's easy to work with. It bends around corners nicely. I like it. This was a cloth that I had been using up until I found this. And you can see this is also a 6-ounce cloth. This has a real tight weave. Doesn't like to bend and stay in place as much. And what I found with this product is once you get it wetted out, I wet the surface prior to applying this. There is another method where you lay the product down and then you wet over the top of it, and then that soaks through the cloth into the substrate. I like the wet method where you apply some epoxy resin, then put the cloth on, make sure it's all wetted out. The reason I like that is because if you're doing a vertical surface, it really helps the cloth stay in place. And it's nice to be able to, you can see your dry spots right away because the cloth will turn almost like a clear when it's wetted out great. And if it's not wet out, you'll see white spots. And maybe I can show that in this video here for you. This is not my favorite cloth anymore. It's really hard to get air bubbles out. I've had so many instances where the air bubbles get trapped behind the cloth. I've tried the bubble rollers, I've tried everything. Not saying it's a horrible product. I just know that it probably has a use, and it's not necessarily my favorite or what works for me. So with that being said, I'm going to grab my epoxy, which I have pre-mixed. And I'm going to just start by applying a good amount of epoxy resin right to the surface. Now, you don't want it to be running, but you want to make sure you have enough product on the surface. That is key. After you do this a couple times, you'll really be able to see how it works. For large surfaces, foam rollers, the epoxy rollers work fantastic because you can cover a large area really quickly. For just these small projects, I just like to use these cheap brushes. They're really inexpensive and they make it really easy. Obviously, you wouldn't want to be using an expensive brush. Try to make sure you have the entire surface wet out. You do not want to have spots on the surface that do not have it because you'll end up with dry spots, which is fine. You can work those out. But it's just so much easier to have the surface wet out, in my opinion, first. It does, each method, the dry or wet layout, has its own advantages. After doing this for 7 years now, I've really kind of adapted to this method very, very well. like I said, you don't not necessarily want runs, but you need to make sure the entire surface is as well. Now I'm making this piece kind of as a demonstration also. I'm doing it because I want to test the strength of it. I build small campers that would be used for putting in the back of the truck, maybe on a trailer, things like that, for minimalist camping, I guess you might say. I love them. They're fun, they're easy, they're relatively inexpensive. There's a few companies out there that make them. I am starting a line of campers myself. I have one sitting over here that I'm currently working on. It's just about ready for paint. But I know that building with foam is very popular. A lot of people use PMF or permanent fiberglass, which is something I've never worked with, so I guess I really don't know that much about it. But the application is very similar to this. I know that when I started using epoxy, I was intimidated because you only have so much time to get the product on and work with it. I'm using a slow curing epoxy right now because it just gives you more time to work. In the warmer temperatures, it really can be difficult to work with, especially when the temperatures get into the 80s and 90s. In Wisconsin, you don't necessarily have that issue. So basically just going to lay the cloth on, and you're just going to start pulling out the areas that, as you lay it down, you're just going to start pulling out the creases and the bubbles and things like that. Now you do have time to work with it. It's not necessarily on any time. But, by the way, I apologize for the quality of my videos. I'm a little new to making videos, so not the greatest at that. But, hey, each their own, right? So you're just going to try to stretch and remove any imperfections in the cloth. It's going to make things a lot easier later. As you can see from this side, it's fairly, I'm going to show you the difference. You can kind of see where you see these white areas. That's where it hasn't penetrated the cloth completely. So all you're going to do with that later, in here, these are the bubbles I'm talking about. You just keep pulling the cloth and working it out. I find it's best just to work with your hands, where you can pull out those areas that need to be stretched a little bit. Once you work with this cloth, it's actually I enjoy it. Also, then you're going to want to take a roller, round your corners up, have a good radius on your corners. I use a router, and you're going to start rolling it out. I always trim my edges after it starts to set because I find that it's just easier. Alright, now you're going to want to take some more epoxy that you've left and hit those dry spots with just a light coating of it, because all of a sudden you're going to see it start turning clear. You can work the cloth a little bit, try not to pull on it, because at this point it's still pretty movable, but it doesn't take long and it will be set up, especially in warm temperatures. And you can clearly see white spots like I had. And with this, one thing I have learned is too much epoxy on the wet out is not great. What happens is if you're doing a large space, that run will start to sag the cloth actually. And you do not want that. So you want to make sure that once you wipe it on, you wipe it off. The excess off, I should say. Because it really is not great. With epoxy, more is not always better. Okay? It's not always better because you're going to run into problems eventually. As you can see, this side is, now everything's pretty clear as to where this side is, which I have not done. You can still see spots that need some additional epoxy. When I first started this, what a disaster. I really didn't have anybody to teach me. I learned everything I could on the internet, which is, to be honest with you, kind of why I'm making these videos. I feel like the internet doesn't have a whole lot of videos, and if there are, I haven't seen them. Then again, I guess I haven't looked lately. You just need to make sure you have enough epoxy that it gets worked in and makes a really nice tight bond. If you let epoxy cure for more than where it gets to the point where it's excuse me, it's more cold, where it is hardened and it's not tacky any longer, you have to sand it before you apply another coat. I like to hit these once they cure for approximately 2 hours temperature. Temperature obviously plays a big part in that. I should hope I have enough. Temperature plays a huge part in how long you wait. But when it's still tacky, I like to go over this with epoxy and a mixture of glass bubbles. A thin, almost, it's still runny, it's not like the you would use for bonding. But what that does is it fills the weave and it cuts out a step where you don't have to sand it between coats. And it really just makes life a lot easier. And you can even do a final coat with that. But I will be showing this after it cures for a couple hours. Like I said, try to remove the runs, and you're gonna have to check back on it after a while, because believe it or not, this feels really thick going on, but after a couple of hours or within an hour, you're gonna have runs. Which is why I always say, don't apply too much. It's just gonna give you trouble later. And sanding raw epoxy can be a little tricky because you don't want to break into this weave at all. So anyway, that's a real quick how-to. Have a great day.